The room was already dim before the photographer arrived. Afternoon light pressed weakly against heavy curtains that had not been fully opened in years, turning the air inside the parlor a muted gold. Dust moved slowly, almost gently, as if it had learned to travel without being seen. On the table near the wall, a leather-bound ledger lay open, its pages filled with neat ink lines recording births, expenses, promises made and kept. A single candle burned beside it, the flame steady, the wax pooled thick and uneven as though time itself had paused to watch. They were told to sit still. That was the instruction, delivered calmly, without cruelty yet without warmth. The chairs were arranged carefully, measured inches apart so that no one leaned too close and no one drifted away. Hands were folded where they could be seen, backs straight, eyes forward. The children understood this posture well. They had practiced it at the dinner table, during prayer, during moments when silence was required to prove respect. The youngest shifted once before stopping, sensing without explanation that movement was not allowed here. The father stood behind them, tall and composed, a man who knew how to occupy space without raising his voice. One hand rested lightly on the back of a chair, fingers relaxed, as though nothing weighed on them. The other hand disappeared inside his coat, hidden from the lens and from the room, tucked away where no one would ask what it held. His face showed no strain. It did not need to. Authority, when practiced long enough, becomes effortless. The mother sat among the children, her body present, her attention somewhere else. Her gaze drifted just past the camera, toward a corner of the room where the light barely reached. It was the look of someone listening rather than watching, as if a voice only she could hear had spoken too softly to interrupt. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced, knuckles pale. She did not move when the photographer adjusted the tripod or when the glass plate was slid carefully into place. The photographer worked quietly. He had done this many times before in homes like this one, for families who wanted their image fixed in time. He checked the angle, adjusted the cloth over his head, measured the light that filtered through the narrow gap in the curtains. He knew what was expected of him: capture respectability, preserve order, make prosperity look permanent. He did not ask questions, he rarely did. Questions slowed the work, and work was what kept his business alive. When the shutter finally opened, there was a brief stillness that felt heavier than the silence before it. For a fraction of a second, everyone held their breath. Then it was over. The shutter closed. The moment passed. What remained was an image that would outlive them all. The photograph was treated with care. The glass plate was clean, the chemicals measured with precision. Later, when the print was ready, it was mounted carefully into a thick album. The album itself was substantial, its cover stiff, its pages heavy, designed to endure. It was placed between other records of the family's existence, near the ledgers that tracked land and money, births and deaths, obligations fulfilled and favors owed. Together, these documents told a story the family wanted remembered. At first glance, the portrait showed exactly what it was meant to show: a family in order, children well kept, parents composed, a home that knew its place in the world. Anyone who looked at it in passing would see nothing unusual. They would see what history expected to see, but history is not always honest at first glance. Near the youngest child's collar, barely visible unless the light struck it just right, there was a small stitched symbol. It was not decorative, it did not match the pattern of the fabric or serve any practical purpose. It sat there quietly, unremarkable to those who did not know what to look for. To most eyes, it was nothing more than a thread out of place. To others, it meant something else entirely. The symbol belonged to a language that was never spoken aloud. It had been used before in closed rooms and private halls, in lodges that did not advertise their existence and institutions that did not welcome questions. It marked belonging, not membership earned but obligation assigned. Those who understood it knew its weight. Those who did not were never meant to ask. At the time the photograph was taken, no one mentioned it. No one leaned closer to examine the stitching. No one asked why it was there or who had placed it so carefully. Silence was not unusual in that house. Silence was a habit practiced daily, rewarded often. Silence kept things orderly. The album was closed, the photograph was displayed. Visitors passed it in the hallway and paused just long enough to admire the frame. Compliments were offered, smiles were returned. The house continued as it always had, moving through its routines with quiet efficiency. Morning prayers, evening meals. Lessons taught and rules reinforced. Discipline delivered, not always with punishment but with expectation. The child wearing the symbol grew older under that expectation. They learned early how to sit still, how to listen without reacting, how to keep thoughts contained. They learned that certain topics were never raised and that curiosity, when misplaced, could lead to consequences that were never fully explained. The symbol remained on the clothing for a time, then disappeared as garments were replaced, but its meaning did not fade with the thread. Years passed. The album remained on the shelf. Dust settled on its cover just as it had settled in the parlor that afternoon in 1910. The photograph became part of the background, absorbed into the home's history, its details no longer examined. Children who were not yet born when it was taken would one day walk past it without knowing what it held. And yet the image waited. Photographs are patient things. They do not argue. They do not reveal themselves unless asked. They sit quietly, holding everything they were given at the moment they were made. Truth, when trapped in silver and paper, does not decay easily. It only waits for the right eyes. The house would change hands one day. The album would be moved from shelf to box, from box to storage. Time would soften memories, blur stories, erase names. But the symbol would remain, stitched into the past, refusing to vanish entirely. It would outlast the intentions that placed it there. What no one in that room could have known, as the shutter closed and the photographer packed his equipment, was that this ordinary portrait would one day be read differently. That what had been designed to preserve control would become a quiet question. That the smallest detail, ignored for decades, would speak louder than the faces that surrounded it. Because even in moments carefully arranged for history, something always slips through. A glance that lingers too long. A hand hidden from view. A mark placed where it does not belong. These are the things that survive when explanations fail. The family believed they had captured permanence. They believed they had sealed their version of the truth between heavy pages and careful ink. They did not realize that history does not only record what is intended, it records what is present. And so the photograph remained, waiting in silence, holding a symbol that did not belong to the world it pretended to represent, asking a question no one was ready to answer yet, a question that would only grow heavier with time. Behind the clean image of family order was a structure built carefully, patiently, like a machine designed to run without noise. It did not rely on constant punishment. It relied on expectation. The kind that settles into the walls and teaches everyone inside how to behave without being told. Floors were polished not just for appearance but to reflect control. Doors were closed softly, never slammed. Even footsteps learned restraint. In that house, obedience was not demanded loudly. It was assumed. Servants entered through the rear door, their presence acknowledged only when necessary, their names spoken less often than their duties. They learned quickly which corridors were theirs and which were not, which hours were safe, and which questions would never be answered. Children absorbed these rules without instruction. They were taught when to speak, when to lower their eyes, and when silence would be praised more than honesty. Reputation mattered more than mercy, and mercy itself was rationed carefully, granted only when it reinforced authority rather than challenged it. The household moved like a clock whose gears were hidden behind decorum, every role fixed, every person replaceable. The symbol stitched into the child's clothing was not an isolated mark. It echoed through the house in quieter forms. It appeared in letters tucked into drawers, written in careful language that said little directly and implied everything else. It rested in the margins of hymn books, faint pencil strokes beside verses about obedience and sacrifice, marks that blended faith with control. It was carved lightly into the underside of a desk drawer, hidden where only hands that already knew to look would ever find it. These were not decorations. They were confirmations. Signals exchanged without words, reminders that the house belonged to something larger than itself. A private authority operated beneath the surface of public morality, invisible to those who did not belong and unquestioned by those who did. Those who wore the symbol were bound by silence, not through threat alone, but through belonging that felt unavoidable. To carry the mark was to accept a role that could not be refused without cost. Those who recognized it knew how to respond. They looked away. They adjusted their tone. They pretended not to notice what was in plain sight. Rumors moved slowly in those years, traveling not through headlines but through pauses in conversation. A sentence left unfinished, a name no longer mentioned. A maid dismissed without explanation, her absence explained with a shrug and a change of subject. A distant cousin sent away for schooling, the word schooling stretched thin to cover something no one wanted to define. Letters stopped arriving. Visits ended. The family never explained these changes because explanation invited judgment, and judgment threatened order. Children noticed more than adults believed. They learned early that curiosity carried weight. That questions could change how people looked at you, how long they stood in a doorway, how closely rules were enforced afterward. One child learned to ask fewer questions not because answers were denied, but because the atmosphere itself grew heavier when they spoke. The injustice in that house was not dramatic. It did not announce itself with raised voices or visible scars. It was procedural, methodical, protected by routine. It lived in schedules, in seating arrangements, and who was allowed to speak during meals and who was expected to listen. It lived in the careful way stories were told and retold until they lost their edges. What allowed it to endure was not cruelty alone, but compliance. Each small act of acceptance made the next easier. Neighbors admired the family from a distance. They praised the children's manners, the home's cleanliness, the parents' generosity. The church spoke their name with approval, grateful for donations that came without hesitation. No one questioned what they benefited from. No one examined the portrait closely enough to wonder why the youngest child's expression did not match the rest. It was not fear that rested there. It was something quieter, resignation. A look learned early, practiced often, perfected before it could be named. In that house, guilt was never confessed aloud. It was documented, archived, filed away with other records that told only part of the truth. Ledgers tracked money, not consequence. Albums preserved faces, not stories. Letters were saved, but meaning was buried between lines. The symbol, barely visible to the eye, became a contract that required no signature. It bound power to silence and silence to survival. Everyone understood their place within it, even if they could not explain it. The house rewarded those who complied and quietly removed those who did not. Over time, this arrangement began to feel natural, as if it had always existed, as if no other way of living were possible. The child marked by the symbol grew within the system, shaped by it. They learned to recognize the sound of approval and the weight of disappointment. They learned how to disappear into a room without leaving it, how to listen without reacting, how to carry something unseen without letting it show. They learned that the most dangerous thing was not disobedience, but exposure. That being noticed for the wrong reason could fracture the careful balance the house depended on, and so they adapted, as many did. The symbol remained small, quiet, almost kind in its invisibility, yet it governed more than any spoken rule. It decided who belonged fully and who belonged conditionally. It separated those who could leave from those who could not. It turned silence into currency and compliance into protection. Years later, when the portrait was glanced at by visitors who saw only order, the truth sat patiently inside the frame. It did not shout, it did not accuse, it waited. Waiting had always been its strength, and the question it carried was simple, though no one asked it yet. How many people must agree not to see something before it disappears completely? The truth did not arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, carried by dust and age and the slow failure of a wall that had been asked to keep secrets longer than it could bear. In 1947, the house was no longer what it had been. Its name had changed hands. Its rooms echoed differently. The people who moved through it did not know its habits, did not feel the weight of its silences, did not lower their voices out of instinct. Renovation was practical, not reverent. Wood was pried loose. Nails were pulled free. Plaster cracked under pressure it had resisted for decades, and then without warning a panel gave way. It did not fall dramatically. It sagged, split, and collapsed inward, releasing what it had been holding back. Letters slid onto the floor in a soft spill, bound together with twine that had grown brittle with time. Dust rose briefly, then settled again as if embarrassed to have been disturbed. The papers lay exposed, yellowed and fragile, their edges curled, their ink faded but still legible. They smelled of old rooms and long waits. Someone bent to gather them, thinking at first they were nothing more than forgotten correspondence. But as the pages were lifted, patterns emerged, dates stretched across years. The handwriting remained careful, controlled, almost restrained. Each letter referenced the same thing without naming it directly, the same mark, the same obligation, the same understanding that could not be spoken plainly, even on paper. These were not casual notes. They were records of endurance. One letter rested slightly apart from the others, as if even in hiding it insisted on distance. Its paper was thinner, its ink darker. The hand was familiar in a way the others were not. This one had been written by the child from the portrait, now grown, now old enough to put words to what had once been felt without language. The letter did not accuse. It did not beg. It explained, calmly, carefully. It described the symbol for what it was, a sign of control. A mark placed on those chosen not for strength but for silence, those expected to carry burdens they had not agreed to bear. It detailed how loyalty had been framed as virtue, how obedience had been praised as faith, how dissent had been punished quietly, not with spectacle but with removal. Access withdrawn, affection rationed, belonging made conditional. Innocence, the letter explained, had been renamed duty, and duty had been used to justify everything that followed. The words were precise. They did not exaggerate, they did not soften. They described a system that did not need to shout to be effective, a system that thrived on patience. As the letters were read one by one, the family name began to shift. It had once been spoken with admiration, carried comfortably in public spaces, associated with generosity and order. Now it felt heavier. Each page added weight. The father's authority, once framed as discipline and leadership, emerged as something else entirely. Fear dressed in ritual, control disguised as care. The habits that had been praised began to resemble strategies. The silence that had been respected began to look like compliance. The portrait was taken down and examined again, this time without the assumptions that had protected it. The arrangement of bodies, the fixed posture, the expressions that had once seemed composed now felt restrained. The youngest child's face, overlooked for so long, came into focus. The resignation there was no longer subtle. It was unmistakable. What had been preserved as dignity now read as containment. What had been called order now looked like enclosure. There was no trial, no courtroom, no moment when accusations were spoken aloud and denied. The truth did not need witnesses beyond the paper itself. It unfolded slowly, privately, as those letters were passed from hand to hand. Each reader came to the same understanding in their own time, that the legacy had been curated. That what had been saved was not the whole story, but a version designed to endure without challenge. The realization did not strike like lightning. It settled, it lingered, it made the air feel different in the room where the letters were read. The symbol, once nearly invisible, now appeared everywhere, in memory, in absence, in the spaces where explanations should have been. It became clear that it had never been meant to survive. It had been designed to function quietly, to disappear as generations passed, to leave behind only the structure it helped maintain. But symbols do not obey intention, they obey time, and time, when patient enough, reveals what was hidden without effort. The letters had survived because someone had chosen not to destroy them, because even within a system built on silence, there had been a need to record, to leave a trace, to say, if only to paper, that this had happened, that this had mattered, that what was carried had weight. The house itself seemed smaller once the truth was known, its rooms less impressive, its walls thinner. The place that had once held authority now felt like a container that had failed. The silence inside it changed. It was no longer protective, it was exposed. The portrait, when returned to its place, no longer commanded admiration. It invited scrutiny. The symbol stitched into the fabric did not glow or darken. It remained exactly as it always had. The difference was in the eyes that looked at it. The family name did not vanish from records. It was not erased from memory, but it no longer stood untouched. It had been entered into a different ledger now, one that accounted for cost as well as success. The letters were archived properly, labeled, preserved, not hidden again. They became part of the official record, though no announcement was made. No ceremony marked their arrival into history. They simply existed, available to anyone willing to read carefully. The truth had not needed confrontation. It had needed time. Decay had done what courage could not. A failing wall had spoken where people had remained quiet. The symbol had endured ink, years, and intention, refusing to disappear simply because it was inconvenient. And in the end, the most unsettling realization was not what had been done, but how easily it had been protected. How many years it had survived because everyone involved had agreed in one way or another not to look too closely. The portrait still exists. The letters still rest in their box. The house stands elsewhere now, altered, unrecognizable. But the question the truth leaves behind remains unchanged, hanging in the quiet where certainty once lived. How many other walls are still holding, waiting for time to do what people could not? Today, the photograph rests behind glass, far from the narrow parlor where it was first taken. The archive is quiet in a way that feels intentional, as if sound itself has been instructed to behave. Labels are typed neatly, dates verified, names corrected where possible. The image is treated with care, not reverence but responsibility. Visitors approach it slowly. Some pause longer than they expect to. Others feel a tightening they cannot explain. A few notice the symbol immediately, their eyes drawn to it as if it were warmer than the rest of the frame. Most do not. They simply feel unsettled, aware that something in the photograph resists comfort. The house itself no longer exists. Its rooms were torn down decades ago, its walls reduced to rubble, its address absorbed into streets that carry no memory of what once stood beneath them. Cars pass where the parlor once held its breath. Children play where silence once ruled. The ground does not remember footsteps the way paper remembers ink. But history is less forgiving than land. It does not erase easily. It stores what it can. The letters remain, preserved carefully, their paper stabilized, their ink protected from light. The portrait remains unchanged, still holding everything it captured in that single moment. Together they offer an understanding that does not announce itself loudly. Harm does not always arrive with raised voices or broken doors. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it dresses well, sometimes it asks to be photographed. The family name still appears in records, but it no longer sits comfortably there. It is spoken with pause now, followed by context. The admiration that once surrounded it has thinned, replaced by questions that do not seek to accuse but to understand. The era that produced the photograph is read differently as well. What was once described as orderly is now examined for what that order required. What was praised as discipline is reconsidered as control. What was hidden is now taught, not as spectacle but as caution. Students learn how systems survive not through cruelty alone but through agreement. They learn how silence can be structured, how obedience can be rewarded, how injustice can wear a respectable face for generations. The child in the photograph never stood in a courtroom, never received restitution, never reclaimed what had been taken quietly over years of compliance. Their life moved forward without apology from those who had shaped it, but their words endured. Their decision to write, to leave a record, ensured that what they carried would not disappear with them. It ensured that others would notice the symbol when they saw it again, that they would ask why it was there, that they would not accept the surface as the whole truth. There is no monument bearing their name, no plaque marking the house that once stood, no bell rung in acknowledgement. The reckoning was smaller than that, quieter and perhaps more lasting. It lives in footnotes, in lectures, in careful glances exchanged between readers who understand what they are holding. The archive does not tell visitors what to feel, it only provides access. It trusts that truth, when made available, will do its own work. Some leave changed, some leave thoughtful, some leave uneasy, unable to explain why a single photograph has stayed with them longer than expected. Outside, the streets continue without interruption. Life moves forward, indifferent to what it replaces. But inside, the silence carries weight. It is not empty. It is filled with what was once suppressed. The photograph does not accuse the viewer. It does not ask for sympathy. It simply exists, holding a symbol that refuses neutrality. It reminds anyone willing to look that silence is not absence. It is participation. And that some names, no matter how carefully preserved, only find peace once the truth is spoken.